Okay, now we're recording, so I'll try to be appropriate. Okay, can everybody see the PowerPoint? Okay. Okay, am I okay sound-wise? Kind of? Okay, so I have Aaron, Eric, and Val on my screen. So you guys, I'm counting on you to give me feedback, okay? Okay, all right. All right, so we've talked about acute changes from a physiological standpoint with aerobic exercise. So now we're gonna move forward and look at what happens when we chronically train in an aerobic way, right? So we're looking at what happens, what physiological changes do we experience, how do we become more efficient from an aerobic standpoint with regular training, right? So that's what this unit is about. One of my favorite units. So while acute aerobic exercise challenges the cardiovascular and respiratory systems, we can actually adapt and improve those systems with regular training, right? So again, we can understand from a physiological standpoint that the cardiovascular system is probably going to be the most important in regards to chronic change because we know that system limits us the most, right? So we talked about in our last unit that the pulmonary system isn't generally a limiting factor for us. So we know that from a chronic standpoint, the most important changes that we can make need to be to whatever that the weakest link is in this particular process, right? So keep in mind that chronic changes that we see with aerobic training are going to be pretty all-encompassing, but our most important changes will be made within the cardiovascular system. Okay. So let's start by looking at what happens when we do regular training as it relates to VO2 max. Now, somebody remind me, what is VO2 max? Can you hear me?
How well your body takes in and utilizes oxygen.
Exactly. How well our body is going to take in and use oxygen. What's the maximum amount of oxygen that I can use? Okay. So, oops. Let me get my pointer up here. So it's easy for us to understand that with training, we're able to improve this factor, right? So with endurance training, more oxygen can be delivered and used by those active muscles. So here you can see on this chart, imagine yourself as an untrained person, and I'm able to, so again, this shows us speed on the bottom here. So that shows us at which speed can we reach our VO2 max. So again, with pre-training, maybe I'm able to reach my VO2 max at 12 kilometers per hour. And then with training, not only am I able to increase my VO2 max, I'm also able to increase the amount of work I can do before I reach that point. Okay, so my VO2 max will occur at a faster speed because I've become more efficient, essentially. Okay. So untrained subjects can demonstrate average increases in VO2 max of 15 to 20% after a 20-week training program. Now, certainly we can appreciate that there are many factors that would affect whether I increased 15% or whether I increased 20%. What are some things that you would consider to be important in determining how much improvement I could make? What determines whether I can do 20% or 15%? Callie, any ideas? You're muted.
Probably your overall just general health.
Okay. Other thoughts, Julia?
Maybe age, I don't know.
Sure. Age could definitely limit us. So, you know, the older an individual is, probably the harder it would be to see these improvements. Okay. Let's see, who else? Abby?
We said like genetics or gender maybe.
Sure, both would be important. Again, notice that we said after a 20-week program. Gutty, what are some factors that you could think of related to that program that might affect how much I could improve?
Like types of workouts and when you're doing them?
Yeah, 20-week training program, like that's one thing, right? But what are you doing within that 20 weeks, right? So again, we can think about the type of training and the intensity and all those different factors. So again, this is cool. We know we can improve VO2 max with regular training, but lots of things we need to think about in terms of helping us understand how much of a change we actually get to see. Okay. So what about submaximal endurance capacity, right? So can we improve from a submaximal standpoint? So a lower steady state heart rate can be seen at the same submaximal intensity with regular training, right? So what do I mean by that? Okay, so imagine that for me right now, a moderate intensity, it would be like running 8:30 per mile. Okay, so I can go out to the track and I can run 8:30 per mile. And if my heart rate is moderate, maybe that's like, I don't know, for me, maybe that's 150. Okay, so my heart rate's at 150 and I'm running at this 8:30 per mile pace. Okay, with regular training, my heart rate at that same pace will go down, right? So that's what we mean when we say a lower steady state heart rate. So again, maybe I do that 20-week training program that we just talked about. So in order for me to go out after I've done that training and run that same pace, that 8:30 per mile pace, maybe now my heart rate is only 130 as opposed to 150. Okay, so I'm going to have a lower steady state heart rate at that same absolute relative or absolute exercise intensity. Okay, average peak speed or velocity can be maintained, or this can also increase. All right, so what do I mean by that? So let's take that same scenario and think about me just keeping a moderate intensity. Okay, so with training, or before I started training, I could run this 8:30 per mile pace, and now I do this training program for 20 weeks. And after 20 weeks, in order for me to be at that same heart rate of 150, now I can run, 755 per mile or something like that. Okay, so my speed has increased. My peak speed or velocity can be increased. All right. We can also maintain this submaximal intensity for a greater period of time. Okay, so currently I could run that 8:30 per mile pace, and I could do 5 miles comfortably. Okay, after this 20-week training program, maybe I could run 7 miles at that pace with no issues. So does that make sense in terms of submaximal? Yes? Okay. Okay, so that gives us kind of an overall view of what's happening from an endurance standpoint. So we know we can improve our maximal capacity, and we know we can also become more efficient at a submaximal level. So now let's take a look at what's actually going on within the cardiovascular system. Okay, so we're going to look at heart changes, so what happens within the myocardium itself, stroke volume, heart rate, cardiac output, blood flow, blood pressure, blood volume. So again, keep in mind that all of these factors, which are super important in our ability to deliver and utilize oxygen, are all going to be enhanced. Isn't that neat? All right, let's start with heart size, okay? Also known as cardiac hypertrophy, okay? What does the word hypertrophy mean? Julian, what's hypertrophy? Julian, you there? Can you hear me?
Yes.
What's hypertrophy?
I do not know what hypertrophy means.
Mason.
It's when it gets bigger.
Yeah, hypertrophy means like an increase in size. You got it. Okay, so when we think about cardiac hypertrophy, keep in mind that us endurance athletes, we got big hearts, all right? So we can see an increase in heart size, essentially. And there are two different kind of classifications to think about. But You know what? One of my goals in my life, and I know this is super weird and some of you already know this about me, one of my goals when I die is to be a cadaver. So I want to be like an anatomy lab like forever. Like I will be teaching you people once I'm dead. I know that's weird, but whatever. I don't care. So anyway, when I get dissected, I want someone to be like, holy shit, check out her heart. Look how big her heart is. I bet she was an endurance athlete, right? Because endurance athletes can have 25% larger heart volume than the average person. Isn't that neat? Aren't you excited about that? I'm assuming you can't hear me because none of you were that excited about that thought, all right? Okay, so let's take a look at what does it mean eccentric hypertrophy and concentric hypertrophy, okay? So eccentric hypertrophy is an increase or an enlargement in the left ventricle cavity, okay? So eccentric hypertrophy is an increase in the size of the chamber, an enlargement of the left ventricle cavity. Now, based on what you know about regular cardiac function, why would it be important or beneficial for an endurance athlete to have a larger left ventricular chamber?
Stroke volume.
Yes, what does that allow the stroke volume to do?
Take in more blood.
Okay, so we can get more blood in the chamber, which means we can send more blood out, which means we can increase stroke volume. So those are all good things that we want to do, okay? So eccentric hypertrophy is, again, that enlargement of the left ventricle chamber, okay? Concentric hypertrophy is a thickening of the chamber walls. So again, you can kind of see that down in this image, okay? So we can see a modest improvement in the thickness of the wall, okay? Why would that be important? Why would you like to have a thicker wall?
Could it like make your heart stronger that way?
Yeah, so when that heart contracts, it can contract with a greater strength, okay? So eccentric hypertrophy allows us to put more blood into the chamber. Concentric hypertrophy allows us to create a stronger contraction when the heart beats, okay? Overall, this can result in about a 25% increase in heart volume in general, okay? There's quite a bit of variation in regards to how much hypertrophy we can see. And there's two factors that are important for this. Okay, so this is reflective of genetics and also our level of adaptation. Okay, so genetics and level of adaptation are important in determining how great of a change we're able to see in the heart volume. And again, those two factors you'll find throughout this lecture that will continue to arise. Okay, so genetics and level of adaptation or level of training are going to be really important in determining how much of a physiological change I can see within the heart, okay? Another thing to note of importance when we think about this hypertrophy factor is that it's reversible, okay? So just because I was fit one time doesn't mean that, boom, I'm always gonna be fit, right? You don't just like, okay, now I got my heart to this optimal size and now I don't have to do anything, right? This is reversible just like when you go to the weight room. Like you go to the weight room, you lift consistently and that's great and you see an increase in muscle mass, but then like you stop doing stuff and your muscles shrink back down, right? So again, keep in mind that the heart size is also dynamic, right? So we can see modifications with this either direction. So this whole concept of use it or lose it, that's a real thing, even when we think about these adaptations that are internal, okay? One last thing when we think about the left ventricle, again, remind me why the left ventricle gets all the attention. Why don't the other three chambers get as much attention when we talk about the heart? Aaron, why does the left ventricle get all the attention?
I don't know.
Let's see, who else is on my screen? Val, why is the left ventricle important?
It sends out the blood to the rest of the body.
Yeah, those 4 chambers are not created equally, right? So the left ventricle has to do most of the work. He sends the blood out to the entire body. And so therefore, he's probably the most important in regards to VO2 max or delivery of blood. Okay, so we'll see a huge change with that left ventricle. And in fact, the left ventricle mass is highly correlated with VO2 max. Okay, so what size that chamber is, how thick the walls are, we can use that to determine what your VO2 max would be, right? So those things are very highly correlated. Okay. Questions on heart size? Everybody's okay? Okay. So now I'm going to throw another scenario at you. Let me get these over here. Now, I want you to think about this whole idea of hypertrophy. And basically, I've just spent the last 5 minutes trying to convince you that this is good, right? This hypertrophy allows the heart to be stronger, allows us to send more blood flow, and that's awesome, right? So now I want you to consider a different scenario in which hypertrophy occurs, okay? Well, here you can see what's known as physiological hypertrophy. And that's what we just talked about. Chronic exercise and actually pregnancy can stimulate this increase in the left ventricle chamber size and also the thickness of the walls. However, under certain scenarios, we can have something known as pathological hypertrophy. What is a pathology? What does pathology mean?
Isn't it dangerous?
Yeah, it is. When you think about pathology,
Like pathogens or like?
yes, you're on the right path.
It studies like diseases.
Yes, the study of diseases, okay? So pathological hypertrophy is going to be hypertrophy associated with some sort of disease, okay? So here are the pathological stimuli that could cause hypertrophy. So hypertension is one, myocardial infarction or heart attack, and also endocrine disorders. Okay, so I want to focus on hypertension. Tell me what hypertension is.
High blood pressure.
High blood pressure, okay? So how would you imagine high blood pressure might affect the heart tissue? I want you to think about this logically. High blood pressure means that the pressure being exerted is going to be greater. So what's probably happening in the heart in order to make that pressure greater, or in order for afterload-induced autoregulation to work? Dad, remind me of the afterload-induced autoregulation. What is that?
Doesn't it like leave more blood in the left ventricle after it contracts?
No, not exactly. Afterload-induced autoregulation was one of the changes we talked about with acute exercise.
I'm not remembering right now.
Let's see, anybody? Mason, have I called on you yet today?
You have, but I don't know this one.
Alicia?
Wouldn't this kind of like contract more, just kind of like leave the pressure to bring it back to like the normal state?
So with afterload-induced autoregulation, we have to produce more pressure to get the blood out, right? So we have to overcome the pressure that's in the aorta. So normal pressure in the aorta is like 120, right? So under normal circumstances, I'm going to produce enough pressure with that contraction to get the blood to flow out. So like 121 or whatever I need to overcome that, okay? With hypertension, because the pressure is greater, I have to contract harder, right? Does that make sense? To get the blood out? Yes? Okay. So that's neat and all, but this is bad, right? Why does this picture, this pathological hypertrophy, look bad compared to what you see in this physiological hypertrophy? What's different?
Left ventricle isn't expanding, it's just smaller.
Yeah, so instead of us increasing the size of the chamber like we did with exercise training, With pathological hypertrophy, I've actually decreased the size of the chamber, okay? And there's a couple other factors I want you to think about. With hypertension, we induce enlargement of the cardiac tissue due to the Frank-Starling mechanism, okay? So basically, we're gonna stretch out those cells. We're gonna stretch them actually past their optimal length, which is going to produce a weakened heart because we decrease force generation. Eventually, because we have this unoptimal overlap of actin and myosin, this heart, the muscle contractile properties will fail eventually, okay? This is why hypertension is bad. Okay, so let me say that again. Hypertension is bad because it causes muscle to grow, producing a smaller left ventricle, so that will inhibit our ability to deliver blood. It also actually weakens these fibers because you're using an unoptimal overlap of actin and myosin, which will weaken the heart tissue, and eventually that heart tissue will then fail. Okay, so hypertension is a good indicator of, I shouldn't say a good indicator, is a lot of times a prerequisite for having a heart attack. And this is exactly why. Okay, so we're gonna have a negative impact on the cardiac tissue as a result of this unoptimal overlap. Does that make sense? Okay, so again, when we think about this stressor of hypertension and your blood pressure is high, right? Well, during exercise, your blood pressure also increases, right? During acute exercise. So why is acute exercise good for us, but hypertension is bad for us? What's the difference? Let's see, who have I not picked on yet? Eric?
I was thinking hypertension, that's going to be, say you work out for an hour in the day. So your acute exercise is only for an hour of the day, but your hypertension was for the other 23.
Exactly.
So it's a lot longer.
Exactly. So imagine if you, again, this is something that I would like to challenge. Imagine you worked out for 24 hours, you know, something like that, right? That's a lot, especially if you don't stop, right? In hypertension, there's no recovery period, right? When we think about exercise training, one of the most important parts of that is recovery. So yes, I can work out really hard for 1 hour, but then I have all this recovery time for the muscle to rebuild, repair. And that's just as important as the actual training session itself. So with hypertension, if I never have that recovery, I'm never able to build myself stronger, if that makes sense, okay? So exercise is going to induce a temporary strain with recovery, and will create this optimal stretch scenario with that Frank-Starling mechanism. With hypertension, there's no recovery, so there's no opportunity to rebuild, if that makes sense. Good. Okay, so we've talked about the changes within the heart tissue. Oh, great. So now my battery's on low. So if I go away, because I left my chargers at school and I'm at home because I thought the internet would work better. Happy Monday. We're doing really great so far today. If my computer dies, then I'll email you guys any concluding remarks, I guess. But keep that in mind. I might go away. So we only have 10 minutes left though, so I think we'll try to hang in there. All right, so we've talked about how the heart tissue itself will change. Also, we're gonna see some substantial changes within stroke volume, okay? So here, notice that you've got pre-training in blue. This was from the same study that I showed you previously with VO2 max. And then you can see post-training in red, okay? On your exam, you'll be asked to indicate how the body changes at rest, during submaximal, and during maximal exercise, okay? So, for example, VO2 max didn't change at rest, but it did improve during maximal exercise. Okay, here you can see stroke volume will change in all three scenarios. Stroke volume will increase at rest, it will increase during submaximal exercise, and it will increase during maximal exercise, okay? So notice that the red, your post-training, is increased in all scenarios, okay? So at rest, it increases submaximal exercise, it increases in maximal exercise, it also increases, okay? Again, the reasons for that were based on those physiological changes that we saw in the heart tissue itself. So we increase the size of the chamber, and that will allow us to send out more blood in one whoosh or in one contraction, okay? So again, that will carry over into all three scenarios, which is great because that's gonna allow us to be more efficient. Okay. Again, this is one of the most important, I would say this is one of the most important adaptations that we can see with chronic aerobic exercise. So check out stroke volume at rest and stroke volume maximal exercise, and check out the differences we see untrained versus highly trained, okay? So at rest, notice that we're seeing this linear increase in stroke volume, and that's because those trained individuals have larger hearts, they have greater blood volume, and thus they're gonna have a higher stroke volume. Okay. Again, Frank-Starling mechanism is primarily responsible for these improvements in stroke volume. We also have a decrease in ESV. Anybody know what ESV is?
It's like the thing that we drew in anatomy, and I can't think of what it's called right now, but it's like a square and then it has like the little loop on the top. Something to do with that.
It's called end systolic volume.
That is correct. In systolic volume, okay? So how much blood is left after I have contraction, basically, okay? So we have a decrease in the amount of blood that we have left. So basically, like, not only do I put more blood into the heart when I'm trained, but I'm also able to get more of it out as well. So it's like it's a 2-for-1 deal here, right? And that'll be related to, again, the increase in the strength of the heart, also a decrease in peripheral resistance, and thus an increase in ejection fraction. So the percentage of blood that I'm able to squirt out like in each contraction, basically, in comparison to how much I had to start. Everybody okay with that sentence down here? I see a yes from Abby, and I see a yes from Mason. Okay. Those are the people I can see right now. All right. So let me say it one more time because I got like a kind of iffy one from somebody, kind of iffy look. All right. So there is a decrease in the end systolic volume. Okay. So there's less blood after a contraction occurs. Okay. And the reason for that is we have a decrease in peripheral resistance. So the amount of resistance that the blood must overcome in order to flow out is going to decrease. And the reason for that is you have more vessels that are leading to like your muscles, okay? So because I have more little roads to lead to my muscle tissue, that's going to decrease the amount of resistance that blood has to overcome. Okay? Because there's less resistance, I can also increase my ejection fraction. So it's easier for me to send more blood out per contraction. Was that better? That clear that up a little bit? Yes? Okay, great. So check this out. Let's look at untrained versus a highly trained person. This is just crazy to me. Their maximum stroke volume is the same as an untrained or a highly trained person at rest. Isn't that freaking cool? Look how much you can have adaptation in your body. Look how freaking cool your body is, right? I can go from being an untrained person, this is me redlining, to me as a super fit person, and I'm just doing that at rest, no big deal. Right? Isn't that insane? Also, look at the capacity to improve. So I could go from 110, I can double that. Okay? So I can do double the work with regular chronic training. All right. And the cool thing with endurance training, I think, is, and again, probably the reason that I've always been drawn to endurance sport, you don't have to be talented to get this change. You don't have to be athletic. You don't have to be coordinated, right? You have to train consistently over time in order to see these changes. Again, not to offend the cross-country runners in the virtual room, but usually we're not that coordinated, right? We're not athletic. The reason that we're successful is because they put in the work day after day and they can see these chronic changes. Did I offend anyone out there? I can't see any of my cross-country people. Shania says no. Gutty says no. Val says no. Okay, good. But again, I think that's the beauty of, you know, having these different, that's why sport's so freaking cool. I don't even have to have any skills. Again, not trying to offend the endurance people out there. You don't have to have any skills to be a good runner. You just have to know how to run. You don't even have to have good form. I've seen some real shitty form, and those people can become all Americans if they work their asses off. So I think this is just a testament to how cool the body is, right? This isn't a limit. This isn't, there's not a limiting factor. You know, you don't have to be smart. You don't have to be talented. You don't have to be athletic in order to see these improvements. You just have to work hard. And so I think that is like really cool. It's like the ultimate equalizer, right? Anyone can improve in this regard. Was that motivational to you guys? Do you guys kind of feel like, okay, like, all right, good. All right, let's look at heart rate. Now, heart rate is going to be different. So remember, when we think about, you know, stroke volume, we're going to see these substantial increases regardless of, you know, the scenario, whether it's at rest, during submaximal and maximal exercise. Well, heart rate's actually the opposite. We're going to see a decrease in heart rate, okay? So post-training, I'm going to see a decrease in heart rate at rest, during submaximal and during maximal exercise. It's about the same. We could actually see our max heart rate decrease with chronic training at maximal, which is kind of weird to think about. The reason for that, the reason we might see a decrease in max heart rate is because we have gained more parasympathetic tone, or we have more of that vagal tone. And so therefore, that is hard to like completely get rid of. So sometimes we see a small decrease in max heart rate with chronic training. However, you could say that they're about equal, so that'd be fine. However, notice that I can do more work at that maximal heart rate. So maybe I can get my heart rate up to the same value, but now I can run faster, or, you know, something along those lines. So again, absolute intensity is increased at which I reach that particular max heart rate, okay? Same thing when we think about, you know, submaximal levels. I gave the example of, you know, as an untrained person, I could run 830 per mile pace at a heart rate of 150. As I become more trained, maybe my heart rate is only 120 when I run at that same intensity. Does that make sense? Yes? Okay. And then when we think about at rest, again, my heart rate is lower at rest. And the reason for that is stroke volume is higher. So those two kind of counterbalance themselves. Okay. So if stroke volume is higher and heart rate is lower, that allows me to maintain the same cardiac output, which is important at rest, because our resting values don't change in terms of our demand for oxygen at rest. Okay. Okay. I'm going to pick up there on Monday, I guess. All right. So again, I will post that schedule. I'm going to head into work right now. So it'll take me 20 minutes, but I'll post the step information, the 12-minute and 1.5 mile run, and then my updated schedule for the next 2 weeks. All right. So I'll get that up by 11. Questions? Give me a thumbs up if you're good. All right, people, enjoy the beautiful day, and I am so looking forward to seeing you in real life again soon. All right?
All right.
Hey, Dr.